Today, we are discussing a childhood story of Crohn's disease and a lesser known root cause. Alexa Federico of Girl in Healing is a functional nutritional therapy practitioner who supports the IBD, autoimmune, and chronic illness communities. She also has Crohn's disease. Welcome, Alexa.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And we did a live together not that long ago, so people can watch that on root cause for Crohn's colitis. But today I said, oh, your story's so interesting. And there's some really interesting facets to this story, guys, that I was blown away. So I wanted to bring you on the longer form and do the podcast. So thank you for being here. Let's get started. You had Crohn's disease as a child. Please tell us about your IBD journey.
Of course. So, yes, I was pretty young at 12 years old when I got diagnosed. And it seemingly, we know there's always root causes and always things that trigger these things, but it seemingly came out of nowhere. I had a pretty unremarkable childhood in terms of health, as well as any other disturbances or negative experiences. I really feel like I had a classic middle-class American child upbringing. Like really nothing too remarkable, loving parents. I had siblings, family close by. I had never even had an ear infection or a broken bone. So pretty healthy by our standards, maybe even a little bit better than our standards. And it was when I was 11 years old. Oh no, I was 12. And then, I was 12 when I started having symptoms of Crohn's disease. And these symptoms started and progressed kind of rapidly over a few months. Now, I know a lot of people will take months, maybe even years to get diagnoses for chronic illnesses, but even so, 3 months felt like a lot when these symptoms were building on each other and impacting my life. So I started to get some classic signs of Crohn's: belly aches, not being able to tolerate a lot of food. I was getting joint pain in my knees. I was getting mouth sores. I was fatigued. And then as it progressed, I would have loose stool and eventually nausea and vomiting. And what happened, my story to diagnosis, was that my mom, who is my greatest advocate of all time, and also a nurse, so she was always clued into when we were sick and was quick to pick up on those things, repeatedly brought me to our pediatrician's office presenting these symptoms as abnormal. And multiple times we were turned away, and she was given some response every time about how this was normal and there's really nothing to be concerned about. They didn't run tests. They had no concerns. I remember specifically one time she was telling the doctor that I was looking thin, and she even noticed my nail beds were getting blue when I'd be a little bit cold. And they were saying things like, she's just a skinny girl. That might happen a little bit. She's just small for her age. And, my mom couldn't put her finger on what was wrong, but she knew this wasn't normal. And so eventually, the last time I entered that pediatrician's office, I was too sick to ignore, and finally was referred to a pediatric gastroenterologist with a suspicion of Crohn's disease. And that gastroenterologist immediately said, "Oh, you need to be admitted. You're very far along." And then I was admitted that day and it was about a 10-day hospital stay. And at that hospital stay, I was finally diagnosed after doing all the scans, the scopes, blood work, talking to numerous doctors, and it ended up being moderate to severe Crohn's disease.
And then what year was that about?
That was about 2007.
Okay, so it was a while ago. They still didn't know as nearly as much as they do today. Now, something I want to talk about that you had said that you had an unremarkable childhood, meaning just nothing truly horribly negative, right? So from your perspective, no trauma. And this is so fascinating to me because not only myself, but the guests I've had on, everyone's had trauma. Pretty much. Maybe I have one guest that not so much, but pretty much everyone's had abuse in their past or something. And you haven't. So I find that fascinating. So how does that compare to your clients? Do you have clients like yourself?
That's a great question.
Or is it rare?
I do have clients that had similar unremarkable childhoods. Typically, though, they had something later in life, some sort of stressor. Maybe not in childhood, but maybe more in their adult life. Oftentimes, I'll have clients that say, I traveled and got some illness there, and then I could never recover, and then I got diagnosed with Crohn's. Or I was in this toxic workplace being worked to death, and eventually I started getting these symptoms, and I got a scope, and they said it was Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. So typically, it's more common than not that my clients say that they've experienced some level of stress or trauma. A death in the family of someone close has been a common one as well. Not always childhood, but typically there is something stressful that preceded their diagnosis. But I have been aware of that childhood, adverse event connection. And whenever, I see people chatting about it, I always go back and try to rack my brain,
Yeah.
This is, it's so, it makes so much sense, and so many people can relate to it. And so I've always scratched my brain, like, what am I not remembering, or what am I not picking up? Because that accounts for so many people's stories. And I've always tried to figure out what piece I'm missing from my childhood, if anything could have been a piece of that. But as far as mental, emotional stress or trauma, I can't put my finger on anything.
Isn't that so interesting, though? And that's great. And I would call your childhood actually remarkable because it was so happy. And I do think there are people out there that just have the physical symptoms. I do think that exists. I absolutely do. We had someone come on, a guest, Evan Botterman, who's studying to be a gastroenterologist, which is so cool. He's in med school. And he seems to just be very similar to you, came from a very supportive family, and then developed these physical symptoms. He got the J pouch, and he's doing fine. He's been doing fine ever since. Now, I do think there's a component physically where you may have to explore at some point the HLA gene and the fact that you have CIRS possibly, but but again, that's physical. That's not a traumatic thing. So it's fascinating. Now, as a child, because you were so young, you were 12 years old, did you carry resentment? Did you say, oh, this sucks? And what did you do with that? How was that?
I very much did for years carry resentment. I had a very hard time accepting the Crohn's diagnosis and what that meant for my new lifestyle and the new version of me. For a very long time, I saw my life before Crohn's and after Crohn's, and definitely had, those stages of grief and resentment, of feeling really angry that I had to live my life differently than other kids my age and had to think about things they didn't have to think about. I, often was more fatigued than them, and I hated that sometimes I needed to miss out on things because of that. I'm a kid, and so food is really important, and would be upset that I couldn't enjoy the pizza party or the ice cream like other kids. And, I was taking a lot of supplements at a young age as well. And I really disliked swallowing pills. And so I would have these standstills where I'd be at the kitchen table having my breakfast or whatever meal and my supplements in front of me that my parents would, put together. And I would sit at the table sometimes for hours and sort of begrudgingly making a stance against taking them. And, my parents never forced me, and they said, okay, you can walk away. You don't have to take them. But I knew that they were helping. And so I did it, but I dragged my feet, and I felt resentful from around that age of 12, probably through my high school years. I feel like college is when I really, my attitude and beliefs about this took a 180. But for years, I was resentful of the life that I feel like I was forced into, and felt like I was at a disadvantage and just unhappy at the way that my body was and how it wasn't like everyone else's, who didn't have to think of, what they ate and how their stomach felt that day, or, taking these supplements or getting a colonoscopy when you're not even a teenager. It wasn't fun, and it's something I carried for a while, for sure.
Yeah, what an experience, especially to be so young and to be so aware of your body. I can't imagine. That must have been such a wild thing.
Absolutely. And I remember one thing. So I was 12, going through, the start of middle school, changing bodies, friendship, circles are changing. I remember, because weight was a hard thing for me. It was very difficult for me to gain and maintain weight when I was younger. And I remember my friends, their bodies starting to change, and I felt I looked like a 12-year-old boy still. And they would, make jokes about not wanting to eat, too much food or too much calories or things like that. And I used to I wished that I had the same problem. Oh, I wish that was my problem, that I didn't want to eat too much ice cream because I'd gain weight, because it was so hard for me to gain weight. And I disliked that so much about myself. I didn't like it all being so skinny. I felt like a skeleton of myself. And so like those adolescent problems and things that other girls were going through, I wished so badly that I could also be going through, but I was having the opposite problems. So it was a very different and unique experience.
Thank you for explaining that, because I think that's important to explain. And, the good outcome is that, look at you now, girl, you're gorgeous. You look great. And I bet if you went back to your high school reunion, you'd look the best. So not that it's a competition, but it is.
I definitely can appreciate where I am today, and that I've made health such a big focus, because I do feel very fortunate that I'm so aware of my health and my body, and I've made a lot of deliberate decisions. So now I'm very thankful for that awareness that I needed. At the time, not so much.
Yeah, I get that, of course. And then, so let's talk about the journey a little bit more. So you had said at some point in your journey, there was birth control, there was prednisone, and then let's talk about the surgery you had.
Yes. So I actually never went on birth control. It wasn't really a concern or interest of mine, but my doctors told me up front that I should not take it ever, the birth control pill, because of the increase in risk of blood clotting.
Wow.
So there's already that risk with Crohn's as well. So I've definitely heard of people with Crohn's. I've had plenty of clients that have been on the birth control pill. But my doctors were actually pretty against me ever considering that. So I was kind of always steered away from that. Prednisone, I was on lots of times. Definitely when I was diagnosed. And then for about a full year, I was going in and out of flares. And so every time I would start to have one of those flares, I'd get on prednisone. But the problem was, once I weaned off that prednisone, the flare just reawakened. So it was a temporary fix. I felt great. I had a little bit of moon face, but I felt great. And it tamed those symptoms, and I could, live my life a bit more normally. But it was a temporary situation. And so it was super frustrating to come off of that thinking it was going to help so much. And it just brought me back to square one. So probably within the span of that first year, I was on prednisone at least 3 to 4 rounds of it, always starting at least 40 milligrams, like always one of the higher doses. So I was on some pretty heavy duty prednisone for a bit. And then a bit later in life, I went on it again, and that was the last time. But early on, yes, prednisone was a big hamster wheel I kept getting on and off of, and it really didn't do me any favors in the end. And then a little bit later in life, more into my adulthood, when I was 25, I believe, I'm now 30, my Crohn's was in a great place. I was maintaining medication free. I had been leaning heavily on the functional holistic side, using diet, supplements, lifestyle, all that sort of stuff for many years. And I had a great functional doctor, and I was feeling great. I had gained a little bit of weight. I was just maintaining my health in all ways. And then I started developing this abdominal pain that was very strong and sharp, burning like, and was very different than anything I'd experienced before. And that happened the spring of 2018. And I, went to a new GI, and we were thinking that it was just, he was mostly thinking it was inflammation. And I was very skeptical because, no time I'd ever had inflammation did my pain feel that way. And so I went on a couple rounds of prednisone. This is the next time I went on prednisone, and that helped. But the same thing was happening as when I was first diagnosed, that the pain would just come back. And this was going on for months, this back and forth. And nothing was being found on any scans we were doing until one time it did. I went in for another scan, and my doctor called me in a panic. There's an abscess. You need to get into the hospital ASAP because we need to get this under control so it doesn't infect your whole body. And so that was really frightening. and I was, hospitalized, and that kind of started a whole new journey for me, another chapter in my Crohn's healing, because that was a very tumultuous time, even more tumultuous than my diagnosis. It was very dark, very depressing. I really felt like there was no end in sight. I wasn't sure if I was dying at times because the pain got so incredible. It was bad. And so we did all of the things that you do for abscesses. You do an abdominal drain. Mine was incredibly painful. They said it shouldn't have been, but I could barely move my body without it creating a sharp pain. We did that for a few weeks to help it drain. I was on antibiotics. I did IV antibiotics at home for weeks and weeks. And unfortunately, the abscess just was never shrinking, which unfortunately is typical. They're very hard to treat because of the way they wall themselves off to protect the rest of the body. So it's a blessing and a curse. And the only way to fully resolve this and get out of this mess was a bowel resection, in which they would put me under the knife. I'd have surgery. They'd be able to fully clean out and remove this abscess. And for me, since I had scar tissue that had built up from, past flares and just my past with Crohn's, they would also do that as part of the resection. So at this point, I was fully on board and felt very at peace with this decision. Even though I had, been leaning heavily on the functional side of medicine, I knew in my heart that this was my way to freedom. This is what was needed. And so I felt very comfortable with the decision. And I ended up having that surgery in January of 2019. So it was almost a full year of going through this up and down. It was kind of a wash of a year, I call it. Like, I didn't do a lot. And I had that surgery. It was a significant surgery with a significant recovery. It was not easy. But I do attribute that surgery to a totally clean slate with my Crohn's. Since then, I've been in remission, medication free. I've had no flares. And I also attribute that to not only having the clean slate, but at 2019, I was a functional nutritional therapy practitioner and more knowledgeable than ever on how I can use food, diet, lifestyle to my advantage. And so I really was going in at my healing with a very whole body, complete picture. And so my daily choices, I know, have helped maintain my remission, and that surgery really was able to give me a clean slate and start fresh. So that, surgery is not something to be taken lightly. It was very major. Some people, unfortunately, have complications from their surgeries. I'm very lucky that I have not, and they've been very, very healthy. But it was a calculated risk, and for me was the right decision after trying all of the more entry-level lines of defense for this.
What an amazing story. And I love the fact that you had the surgery done in 2019, because if you tried to do it in 2020, forget it. I don't know if you would have, I don't know if you would have gotten it done, or you would have gotten it done maybe 2023, because it would have been pushed back. And it's so funny that you said 2019 was a wash of a year, and then we get to 2020 with COVID. So that's good in a way, because you got to relax at least and recover from the surgery. But what a story. And it's called bowel resection. I just want to make sure.
Bowel resection, yes.
Okay.
So I didn't need a bag of any kind. They kind of just go in there and take out what they need to take out and put everything back together.
Okay,
just take
great.
out the pieces of the most diseased intestine, and then of course the infection. If you had one like I did, they would clean that out.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that story of sometimes you need to do things that you never thought you were going to do in this journey, and surgery can be one of them, and surgery can help and give a clean slate, like I said with Evan Boderman, who did the J pouch and the whole thing, and he's doing really well today in med school. So I think that it just gives you another option, and it says, someone did this who's a very natural, holistic, functional. I mean, this is your livelihood. This is what you do for a living. And you still said, I'm going to do the surgery. So good on you. I think that's some great advice for people. Now, speaking of advice, what advice can you give to parents of children with IBD?
Yes. So as I've said, my parents, especially my mom, were integral to my healing and my advocacy, and they truly demonstrated how you advocate for yourself. And now I feel very confident in that because of them. I went from someone who wouldn't want to rock the boat, wouldn't want to use my voice, very, very shy, hid behind my mom as a child, like didn't want to be in the spotlight of any kind. And I, have no problem using my voice now. So it's still scary sometimes, but they really showed me. So first, I would say be that mama bear, papa bear for your child, and let them see you advocate for themselves and for their child, because your child will pick up on that. And that is such a vital skill when you have a chronic condition, to learn to speak up for what you need, and ask questions and speak your concerns. It's the most important skill you have to take away from this, because there are going to be many times where you need to speak up and you're going to have a different opinion or a major concern, when you're given some healthcare advice, and your voice is important because this is your health. So be that advocate for them. Of course, I'm going to say take a whole body look at this condition. So reach out to different specialists, get different opinions, and just soak up what they say. We all have different approaches, even in the functional and holistic space. We have different ways of doing things. So the same way that you vet healthcare practitioners, providers, and doctors of all kinds, you can do the same thing with your holistic health practitioners, but definitely seek out their support, because they have a perspective on healing that the specialist, the conventional medical doctors don't have. And the way to heal through these is very much a multifaceted approach. So I would say get in on that early. Don't delay, especially if the condition you're dealing with is something like IBD that is inflammation based, because we want to minimize the inflammation that is going on, especially in the gut, because it creates scar tissue if it's not addressed. So definitely being open to a wide variety of approaches. My family, we weren't like holistic or crunchy. And so when I first saw my functional doctor, I was like, he's going to make me change my diet. I can't eat this or that. I'm going to be taking supplements. Like, we did not do that. But between a rock and a hard place, we took that chance. So just be open to things that you maybe never thought you would do. And then have grace and patience for your child. Even though I know you're working so hard to talk to these practitioners, buy the supplements, schedule the appointments, they may have resentment and resistance like I did. But I am so happy that my parents pushed through and still stayed by my side, didn't give me too much of a hard time when I was being, super resistant and maybe bratty, because they really understood what I was going through was so unique and really difficult. So just having grace and patience for the process, and continuing to introduce, whether it's certain foods, supplements, because eventually the habit will build and they'll get used to it. And when your child feels the difference of how they're feeling so much better, have more energy, taking this strange approach that maybe they don't want to take, they will stick with it. So I would say those are all my top pieces of advice. And I'll add one more, and that is, if you can adapt some of the changes that you're doing for your child for you as well, that can help ease the transition and process too. So my parents, when I had to overhaul my diet from pretty standard American to a more gluten, dairy free, more whole food based, they adopted as much as they could that diet for me. So they didn't keep a lot of the standard American snacks in the house for my other siblings. We kind of all changed our lifestyle for the better, It really helped everyone involved. But making your child feel less alone and joining in with them can really ease that process too.
Okay, perfect. I think that's really good advice. I remember Dane Johnson came on and said the same thing. If the whole family adopts the lifestyle, it really helps the one child. So that is great. What do you think are the root causes of IBD? What do you see from your clients?
I really believe that it is a spectrum and can be a singular one of these things or a mishmash, a variety. Because I do take this approach that I did not make up. It's very prevalent in the holistic healing space that we all have a beaker of stress. And we are resilient humans and we can tolerate lots of stress in our lives. But at some point, if we don't have an outlet, whether that's an emotional outlet or a physical outlet like detoxification, those stressors build and then they spill over. And when it spills over, because we aren't able to deal with them, that is when disease or other dysfunction can manifest. And so I think for some people, it is one thing, and that could be a childhood trauma that stays with you. It could be like simply working in that overly pushy, toxic job to your breaking point and disease manifests. I believe it's possible that childhood vaccines could play a role, since the amount of vaccines children get has just absolutely increased drastically since from when I was a child even. So that's bombarding the immune system with a lot of things. I think diet certainly can play a role if we're, especially in our youngest, most vulnerable years, if we're building our bodies on food that is pesticide laden, not real, like we're not basing our diet on whole foods. I think that can be very confusing to the body. I think it really can be all of these things: emotional, physical, environmental. And again, I think for some people, they can even pinpoint it to this one thing, like a childhood that was filled with a lot of trauma, or a death, and I was never the same after this emotionally. Or maybe people like me who can't really pinpoint it with one thing, but we certainly didn't have the most perfect diet. We had whole foods in our diet, but I had plenty of things that were artificial, pesticide laden. I did get vaccinated as a child for whatever was typical for the schedule at that time. And who knows what other environmental things I could have been exposed to. So I think that it can be a combination, or for some people more heavily on one of these factors. But I do think chronic illnesses, autoimmunity, all can be a mixing pot of various things. And just as modern day society progresses and there's more things thrown at us, I think it just gets more complex, the cause of these.
Okay, so with environmental, you mean things like bacterias, glyphosate, mold, things like that, parasites. That's what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Heavy metals, any and all of those things.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to clarify that. I love that you brought up the vaccines. See, I have to stop in podcasting saying I love. What should I say? What should I say? I'm very happy that you brought up the vaccines, because I agree, and I follow a really good Ayurvedic expert, Marianne Teitelbaum, and she's been doing this since the 80s. She's a doctor, and in the 80s in the US, I think the number was something like kids had to have 11 vaccines to go to school. Now it's up to something like 64 to go to school. Yeah. And in her practice, she saw a massive rise in autism because of that. Now, we're not talking about autism today, but that's just to give you a really good example. And again, if you have the HLA gene and you have all these childhood vaccines, or even like me, Peace Corps vaccines, or you did a huge trip to Africa or India or any of these places where you have to get massive vaccines, I have seen that really affect people. What do you think, Alexa?
I think it's definitely a possibility. And as we've seen, I mean, I have the same perspective. I don't work with children, so it's a little bit, I can't really pinpoint it to my practice, as that Ayurvedic doctor can. But certainly we've seen, just as in a society, viewpoint, autoimmunity, chronic illnesses increase. That does correlate with the drastic increase in vaccines that have also been required to attend school. And sometimes in the workplace even, we're requiring flu shots in some places of work. So I think it's very much a possibility. I know that is a controversial, depending on what circle you're talking in, but can be a controversial take that vaccines can be contributing. But I am absolutely open to that possibility, and I think there's something there. I've actually wanted to try and look at my childhood medical records and figure out how I can get a hold of those and see, the timeline, and also which ones I did get, and just kind of do a little research into that. But I think even if you're a believer that they can help prevent against certain illnesses, we still have to acknowledge that they're not perfect. Even if you have that belief that there is a possibility that they are overstimulating the immune system, especially to a small child. That just sounds like a crazy amount. We're so careful with so many things, with pregnancy and birth and raising children, and it is a bit shocking to me, quite shocking, that we are allowed, and not only allowed, required and pushed to do so many vaccines in such a young, small, growing body. Yeah, so that's where I stand on that one.
Yeah, and now we've added the COVID vaccine or vaccines, and that's very controversial depending on what you think, but we are finding that a lot of people who did get jabbed started to get IBD symptoms, started to get CIRS symptoms. So this is something that we need to really pay attention to. Now, we are running out of time, unfortunately. So I know that, well, first of all, I want you to talk about your practice, But actually, before you do that, I want you to tell us a easy, simple recipe, because I know you love to cook and I love your Instagram, that those of us with IBD or a busy parent of a child with IBD can make.
Love that. Okay. So, especially when you're busy and you have children, two categories of foods that are gentle on the digestive system and are easy and simple to make are soups and smoothies. So, two, like one is just the cold version and one's the hot version of the other. So, I'll kind of give you like two recipes or things to go towards, depending on the time of year, what your child likes. But I'm a big fan of batch cooking soups, especially if you can make them bone broth based, because you're getting tons of gut healing proteins in that bone broth. But any sort of soup that you like can be made with bone broth and can be made easy in the digestive system. It's kind of the nature of soup. Things are slow cooked, they're broken down, it's easier on our gut. So anything from a chicken and veggie soup to like a blended veggie soup. I love doing a butternut squash soup. I'll get frozen chunks of butternut squash, add bone broth, coconut milk, salt, pepper, some spices, and you just have to put it in a blender.
Wow.
I steam the squash first just to make it nice and soft and easy, but it is done. You blend it up and it is done. So you can easily batch cook that, add any flavors or spices or herbs that you like, and freeze it even for individual servings whenever you need to pull them out. But soup, and maybe your child doesn't like that, but they like a chicken noodle soup. Easy. Still super gut healing. You can use rice or gluten-free noodles if you'd like. So I think that should be something that's in everyone's rotation, especially if you're dealing with inflammation or a flare-up. That is like a go-to food for sure. And smoothies are also great because you can add, if you're taking any sort of supplements, it's a great way to hide and sneak in and get in supplements. So whether it's a probiotic, you can open up probiotics and put them in smoothies, or if you're taking another herbal anti-inflammatory, you can throw it in a smoothie. But bananas with a little avocado as well is the just perfect match for a nice thick smoothie. They're great for texture. I like to add a little bit of pumpkin to mine as well. It's not very strong on the flavor, but it also helps just with texture. And then for your child, if they are a little bit resistant to smoothies, you could get a dark chocolate cocoa powder and add like a teaspoon at a time. A teaspoon would probably be plenty. And add, electrolytes to that as well. That's what I do with mine. And it ends up being like this thick chocolate frosty like smoothie that probably resembles things that like a Wendy's or McDonald's makes. That's what I feel like they resemble when I drink them. But even though there's a little bit of dark chocolate in there, you're still getting fruits, potentially other supplements that maybe your child doesn't really want to take on a daily basis, and they're nice and hidden in there. So anything that is more liquid based or blended up is great. Sometimes cooked foods like a soup or a stew is more gentle on the gut. I tend to see that the digestive tract likes warmth versus cool. So it kind of just depends on your body, but those are two that work well for children and for gut health.
Very cool. I'm going to try them, and I like the idea of pumpkin because I love pumpkin. I never thought of that, so that's pretty cool. So will you please tell us about Girl in Healing and the services you offer?
Sure thing. So what I offer mainly right now are a few options. So for adults, I have a private one-on-one practice and also a self-paced course. For children under 18, I hold parent consultations where we sit down for 45 minutes virtually, and you can bring all of your questions, any information about your child, and we basically have a Q&A and protocol planning session. So I'll answer your questions about your child's health and IBD. I'll give you strategies dietarily, supplementally, and just lifestyle based. Oftentimes we're talking about school and this idea of fitting in and how can I ease the transition of making this our new normal. So we can chat through all sorts of categories. So that's a great option. If you're, here listening on behalf of your child, we can discuss all the same things I would talk about with my adult clients.
Okay, very cool. And tell us where to find you.
Sure thing. So on Instagram and TikTok, Girl in Healing, and my website is girlinhealing.com.
Very cool. Great name. I love following you on Instagram. I get some really good ideas, definitely for food. So that's really helpful. And you're really good at Instagram. I'm so bad at social media, but I have no interest in, and I'm trying my best, but not doing so well. But yeah, I love your Instagram. So definitely follow Girl in Healing. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. It will help so many parents and so many children and so many of my listeners. So here's how we end, Alexa, is in my household, a perfect poo is called a green heart. I would love for you to wish the listeners a green heart day.
I wish all the listeners a green heart day.
Thank you.
Thank you.